On a humid September evening in 2003, the city of Lakeland, Florida was settling into the familiar rhythm of late summer. The sun hung low over the citrus groves that still dotted the landscape between strip malls and subdivisions, casting long shadows across neighborhoods where families were finishing dinner, where children played in front yards under the watchful eyes of parents who believed their world was safe. In a modest apartment complex on the south side of town, a place where working people lived quiet lives, where neighbors knew each other's names but rarely their secrets, a young woman named Jennifer Marshall was getting ready for an evening shift at the restaurant where she worked. She was 23 years old, full of plans and possibilities, the kind of person who smiled easily and remembered everyone's birthday. Her car was parked in its usual spot. Her apartment door was unlocked, the way it often was in those final minutes before leaving. And somewhere in that ordinary moment, in that slice of unremarkable time that should have been forgotten by morning, something happened that would haunt Lakeland for more than 2 decades. Before we continue with this story of silence, secrets, and a truth that took 20 years to surface, go ahead and subscribe to Cold Crime Cases. This channel brings you true crime stories that matter, cases that remind us why we can't look away, why we can't forget, and why some questions deserve answers no matter how long it takes to find them. What would you do if someone you knew, someone you trusted, someone who sat across from investigators and looked them in the eye, carried a secret so heavy it changed the shape of their entire life? Would you see it in their face? Would you wonder about the weight they carried every single day for 2 decades? Jennifer Marshall was not supposed to disappear. She was not the kind of person who vanished without explanation, without goodbyes, without leaving some trace of intention. She had grown up in Winter Haven, about 20 miles east of Lakeland, in a family that was close-knit and loving despite the financial struggles that defined so much of their lives. Her mother, Sandra Marshall, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide. Her father had left when Jennifer was young, and she rarely spoke about him. She had an older brother, Michael, who lived in Tampa and called every Sunday. She had friends from high school who still met for coffee, co-workers who looked forward to her shifts because she made the long hours easier, a grandmother in Bartow who she visited every other weekend without fail. Jennifer's life in Lakeland was not glamorous, but it was hers. She had moved there 2 years earlier, in 2001, after finishing a certificate program in hospitality management at Polk State College. She wanted to work her way up in the restaurant industry, maybe manage a hotel one day, maybe move to Orlando where the opportunities were bigger and brighter. She worked at a chain restaurant off Highway 98, the kind of place where families came for birthdays and retirees ordered the early bird special. Her manager said she was reliable, cheerful, good with difficult customers. Her co-workers said she was the kind of person who stayed late to help close even when it wasn't her job, who covered shifts when someone called in sick, who remembered that one waitress was saving for her daughter's braces and another was studying for the GED. On that September evening, Jennifer was supposed to work the dinner shift starting at 5:30. She had called her mother that afternoon to talk about nothing in particular, the way they did most days. Sandra would later remember every detail of that conversation, the sound of her daughter's voice, the way she laughed about a customer who had ordered a steak well done and then complained it was too dry, the plan to visit that weekend and help her grandmother plant fall flowers. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Jennifer said she needed to get ready for work, said she loved her, said she'd call tomorrow. And then she was gone. When Jennifer didn't show up for her shift, her manager tried calling. No answer. He called again an hour later, then again. By 7 o'clock, he was annoyed. By 8, he was concerned. Jennifer had never missed a shift without calling, had never been unreachable like this. He thought about driving to her apartment but didn't. He was busy, it was a Saturday night, the restaurant was packed. He assumed there was an explanation, some emergency, some misunderstanding. He had no way of knowing that Jennifer would never answer another phone call, that her silence had already begun, that the clock was already ticking on a mystery that would consume more than 2 decades. When Sandra Marshall didn't hear from her daughter by Sunday afternoon, she knew something was wrong. A mother knows. There's an instinct that goes beyond logic, beyond the explanations people offer to calm you down. Jennifer called every day. Every single day. Even when she was busy, even when the call was just 2 minutes long, she called. Sandra tried Jennifer's cell phone a dozen times. Straight to voicemail. She called the restaurant and learned Jennifer hadn't shown up for work, hadn't called in. She called Jennifer's friends, her co-workers, her neighbor across the hall. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. By Sunday evening, Sandra was driving to Lakeland with Michael, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, her mind racing through every possibility except the one she couldn't bear to name. Jennifer's apartment was unlocked. That detail would echo through the investigation for years, a small fact that felt enormous in retrospect. The door wasn't forced. There were no signs of struggle. Jennifer's purse was on the kitchen counter, her wallet inside, her keys beside it. Her work uniform was laid out on the bed, black pants and a white button-down shirt, still waiting to be worn. Her cell phone was plugged in by the nightstand, the battery full, the screen dark and silent. Everything looked normal, looked like Jennifer had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. Except she never came back. Sandra called the Lakeland Police Department from her daughter's apartment, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that something was terribly wrong, that her daughter wouldn't just leave like this, that she needed help right now. The dispatcher was calm, professional, explained that adults had the right to come and go as they pleased, that 24 hours wasn't unusual, that most missing persons cases resolved themselves quickly. Sandra wanted to scream. She wanted to reach through the phone and make someone understand that this wasn't a case, this wasn't a statistic, this was her daughter, and she was gone. By Monday morning, when Jennifer still hadn't surfaced, hadn't called, hadn't used her credit cards or accessed her bank account, the Lakeland Police Department opened a missing persons investigation. Detective Robert Chen was assigned to the case, a 15-year veteran who had worked dozens of missing persons reports, most of which ended with the person walking through their front door with an apology and an explanation. But there was something about this one that bothered him from the start. Jennifer Marshall didn't fit the profile of someone who would disappear voluntarily. No history of mental health crises. No drug use. No abusive relationship she might be fleeing. No debt, no legal troubles, no reason to run. And yet she was gone, as completely as if she had never existed. Chen started with the basics. He interviewed Jennifer's mother, her brother, her closest friends. He spoke with her manager and co-workers at the restaurant. He talked to neighbors in the apartment complex, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on Saturday evening. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was liked, trusted, ordinary in the best possible way. No enemies. No drama. No secrets that anyone knew about. She dated occasionally but wasn't seeing anyone seriously. She got along with everyone. She was careful, responsible, not the type to take risks or trust strangers. Nothing in her life suggested she was in danger, and yet danger had clearly found her. The investigation moved to Jennifer's apartment. Crime scene technicians processed the space, looking for evidence of foul play, signs of struggle, anything that might explain what happened. They found nothing. No blood. No fingerprints that didn't belong. No forced entry. The apartment was clean, organized, exactly as you'd expect from someone who was planning to leave for work in a few minutes. Jennifer's laptop was on the kitchen table. Chen went through her emails, her browser history, her social media accounts. Nothing suspicious. Conversations about work schedules and weekend plans. Photos of friends and family. A life that was completely, frustratingly normal. Chen pulled Jennifer's phone records. Her last call had been to her mother on Saturday afternoon at 3:18. Before that, a few text messages with co-workers, a call to her grandmother on Friday night. Nothing out of the ordinary. No calls or texts from unknown numbers. No pattern that raised red flags. Her bank records showed the same thing, a modest income, regular expenses, nothing unusual. She had withdrawn $40 from an ATM on Friday afternoon and hadn't used her debit card since. The money wasn't in her apartment. Chen thought about that detail more than once, wondered if she'd had that cash with her when she disappeared, wondered what it might mean or if it meant anything at all. By the end of the first week, Chen had conducted more than 30 interviews and had almost nothing to show for it. No witnesses. No suspects. No leads. Jennifer had simply vanished, and the only clue was the fact that she'd vanished at all. Her car was still in the parking lot, which meant she either left on foot or left with someone she knew. The apartment complex had no security cameras. The surrounding businesses had cameras, but none pointed toward Jennifer's building. In 2003, surveillance wasn't what it would become, wasn't the web of digital eyes that would later make disappearing almost impossible. There were gaps, blind spots, places where people could slip through unseen. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Lakeland might have been a city of nearly 90,000 people, but it still had the heart of a small town, the kind of place where tragedy pulled everyone together. Sandra Marshall organized search parties, and hundreds of volunteers showed up. They combed through wooded areas near the apartment complex, walked along roads and railroad tracks, checked dumpsters and abandoned buildings. They put up flyers with Jennifer's photograph, her smiling face staring out from every telephone pole and storefront window. Local news stations covered the story. Tips poured into the police department, dozens of them, people reporting sightings of young women who looked like Jennifer, cars they'd seen near her apartment, suspicious men hanging around the area. Chen followed up on every single one. None led anywhere. As September turned to October, as the days grew shorter and the heat finally began to ease, the reality settled over Sandra Marshall and her family like a weight they would carry forever. Jennifer was not coming home. Whatever had happened to her on that Saturday evening, it had been final. The hope that maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown, maybe she was confused or scared or running from something they didn't understand, that hope died a little more each day. Sandra knew her daughter was dead. She couldn't explain how she knew, but she knew it the way she'd known something was wrong that first Sunday afternoon. The question wasn't whether Jennifer was gone. The question was who had taken her, and why, and whether anyone would ever answer for it. Chen worked the case with the kind of focus that consumed him. He stayed late, came in early, dreamed about details he might have missed. He interviewed Jennifer's ex-boyfriends, tracked down everyone she'd ever mentioned in passing, looked into registered sex offenders living within a 5-mile radius of her apartment. He found nothing. No one with means or motive. No one whose story didn't check out. The case was like trying to hold water in his hands, the harder he gripped, the more it slipped away. By the end of October, the leads had dried up. The tips had stopped coming. The story had moved off the front page. And Jennifer Marshall had become another name in a file, another face on a poster that would fade in the Florida sun. The first year was the hardest for Sandra. She couldn't sleep in her own house anymore, couldn't bear the silence, the empty space where her daughter's voice should have been. She stayed with her mother in Bartow, the two of them comforting each other through long nights when grief felt like drowning. She called Detective Chen every week, then every few days, then every day, asking if there was any news, any progress, anything at all. Chen was always kind, always patient, but the answer was always the same. No news. No breaks. No answers. He promised he hadn't given up, and Sandra believed him, but she also understood the reality. Michael Marshall struggled in different ways. He blamed himself for not being closer, for not visiting more often, for not sensing that his sister needed protection. He became obsessed with the case, spent hours online reading about missing persons investigations, about statistics and patterns and ways cases got solved. He learned that most murders are committed by someone the victim knows, that strangers rarely strike without leaving evidence, that the first 48 hours are critical and they'd passed long ago. He started his own investigation, showing up in Lakeland on weekends to talk to people the police had already interviewed, retracing his sister's steps, looking for something everyone else had missed. He found nothing, but he couldn't stop looking. The not knowing was worse than any answer could be. In those early months, there were theories. There are always theories when someone vanishes without explanation. Some people thought Jennifer had met someone online, some dangerous person who had lured her away. But there was no evidence of that in her computer or phone records, no dating apps or chat room conversations, nothing to suggest she was talking to strangers. Others thought maybe she'd witnessed something, seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and been silenced because of it. But what? And by whom? The theories were like shadows, taking shape in the absence of light, dissolving when you looked at them directly. Detective Chen had his own theory, though he rarely spoke it aloud. He believed Jennifer had been taken by someone she knew, someone who had access to her apartment, someone she trusted enough to let inside or leave with. The unlocked door suggested she'd been planning to return in moments, maybe had stepped outside to help someone carry something or to talk for just a minute. Maybe she'd been surprised, overpowered quickly, before she could scream or fight back. Or maybe she'd gone willingly, not knowing she was in danger until it was too late. Chen looked hard at the men in Jennifer's life, co-workers, neighbors, casual friends. He administered polygraph tests to those who agreed. Everyone passed or the results were inconclusive. He requested phone records and alibis. Everything checked out or couldn't be disproven. Whoever had taken Jennifer, they were careful, they were lucky, or they were both. As 2003 became 2004, life in Lakeland moved forward the way life always does, despite tragedy, despite unanswered questions. The restaurant where Jennifer worked hired someone new. The apartment complex filled her unit with a young couple who had no idea about the woman who'd lived there before them. The posters with Jennifer's face faded and were torn down or covered over. The story slipped from the local news cycle. People still remembered, people who had known Jennifer, people who had joined the searches, people who had followed the case closely. But for most of Lakeland, Jennifer Marshall became a sad story from a few years ago, a name you might recall if someone mentioned it, a reminder to lock your doors and be careful. But for Sandra Marshall, for Michael, for Jennifer's grandmother and her closest friends, time didn't heal anything. It only stretched the pain thinner, made it harder to breathe through, harder to explain to people who hadn't lost what they'd lost. Sandra kept Jennifer's room exactly as it had been, clothes still hanging in the closet, books still stacked on the nightstand, photographs on the walls. She talked to her daughter sometimes, late at night, asking her questions that would never be answered. Where are you? What happened? Are you at peace? Chen kept the case file on his desk for 2 years before it was finally boxed up and moved to storage. Even then, he didn't forget. He couldn't. Some cases burrow under your skin and stay there. He'd drive past Jennifer's old apartment complex sometimes, wondering if the person who took her still lived nearby, still walked the same streets, still slept soundly at night while a mother cried for her daughter. He'd pull the file every few months and read through it again, hoping something would click, some detail he'd overlooked would suddenly make sense. It never did. The Lakeland Police Department kept the case officially open, but active investigation stopped. There were simply no more leads to follow, no more avenues to explore. The case went cold not because anyone gave up, but because there was nowhere left to look. Jennifer's DNA was entered into national databases. Her information was shared with other agencies, compared against unidentified remains found across the state and country. Nothing matched. She had vanished so completely it was as if she'd never existed at all. Years passed. 2004 became 2005, became 2006. Sandra Marshall started a support group for families of missing persons in Polk County. It gave her a purpose, a way to channel grief into something that might help others. Michael moved to Georgia for work but came back every year on the anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance. They held small memorials, just family and a few close friends, lighting candles and sharing memories. The gatherings grew smaller each year. Not because people cared less, but because life demanded they move forward even when their hearts couldn't. In 2007, Detective Chen retired from the Lakeland Police Department. On his last day, he stopped by to see Sandra Marshall. He apologized for not solving the case, for not bringing Jennifer home. Sandra told him she knew he'd tried, knew he'd done everything he could, and she thanked him for not forgetting. Chen promised her that the new detective assigned to cold cases would keep looking, would keep Jennifer's file active. He meant it when he said it, but he also knew the reality. Without new evidence, without a witness or a confession, the case would likely never be solved. Some mysteries don't have endings, just silence that stretches on forever. The new detective assigned to review cold cases was named Maria Gonzalez, a sharp investigator in her late 30s who had transferred to Lakeland from Miami. She inherited dozens of unsolved cases, stacks of files representing lives cut short and families left with questions. Jennifer Marshall's case was one of them. Gonzalez read through the file in the spring of 2008, nearly 5 years after Jennifer's disappearance, and felt the familiar frustration that comes with cold cases. Everything had been done right. The initial investigation had been thorough, professional, exhaustive. Chen had missed nothing obvious. The problem wasn't the investigation. The problem was that there was nothing to find. But Gonzalez noticed something that intrigued her, a small detail buried in the interview notes. Several of Jennifer's co-workers had mentioned a regular customer at the restaurant, a man named David Brennan who came in 2 or 3 times a week, always sat in Jennifer's section when she was working, always made small talk. The co-workers described him as friendly, polite, maybe a little too interested in Jennifer, but nothing that raised serious alarms. Chen had interviewed Brennan in the first week of the investigation. Brennan had explained that he lived nearby, that he ate at the restaurant because it was convenient, that he'd chatted with Jennifer the way you chat with servers you see regularly. He'd seemed genuinely shocked by her disappearance, had even joined one of the early search parties. His alibi for the evening Jennifer vanished was thin but not impossible. He said he'd been home alone, watching television. No one could confirm it, but no one could disprove it either. He'd agreed to a polygraph test and passed. Chen had cleared him and moved on. Gonzalez pulled Brennan's background. He was 38 in 2003, had lived in Lakeland most of his life, worked as a maintenance supervisor for a property management company. No criminal record beyond a DUI from the late 90s. No history of violence or harassment. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But something about the way the co-workers had described him stuck with Gonzalez. A little too interested. What did that mean? She made a note to find Brennan and talk to him again, not because she thought he was guilty, but because sometimes people remember more after years have passed, sometimes guilt or knowledge changes how they tell their stories. Life had changed for David Brennan in the years since 2003. He still lived in Lakeland, still worked for the same property management company, though he'd been promoted to regional manager. He'd married in 2006, a woman named Kelly who worked as a dental hygienist. They had a daughter who was 2 years old. From the outside, Brennan's life looked stable, successful, normal. But people who knew him well might have noticed small things, the way he never wanted to talk about the past, the way he avoided certain parts of town, the way his mood would darken if someone mentioned cold cases or unsolved crimes on the news. Kelly Brennan knew her husband had been questioned in a missing persons case years ago, before they met. David had told her about it early in their relationship, explaining that he'd been a regular at a restaurant where a waitress had disappeared, that the police had talked to everyone who knew her, that it had been scary and sad but he'd had nothing to do with it. Kelly had accepted the explanation without question. Why wouldn't she? David was kind, hard-working, devoted. He was a good husband and father. The idea that he could be connected to something dark seemed absurd. But marriage reveals people in ways dating never does. You learn their habits, their fears, the things that wake them in the middle of the night. Kelly had noticed that David didn't sleep well, hadn't for years. He'd startle awake sometimes, breathing hard, and when she asked what was wrong he'd say it was just a bad dream, nothing important. She noticed he drank more than he used to, not enough to be a problem but enough that she wondered why he needed it. She noticed he was protective of his phone, his computer, his privacy in small ways that felt slightly off. She told herself everyone had their quirks, their private spaces. She didn't push. In the fall of 2008, Gonzalez located David Brennan and called him to request a follow-up interview. Brennan agreed, seemed willing to help, said he'd be happy to answer any questions if it might lead to finding out what happened to Jennifer. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Lakeland on a Wednesday afternoon. Gonzalez had done hundreds of interviews, had developed instincts about people, about the stories they told and the truths they tried to hide. She watched Brennan carefully as they talked, looking for inconsistencies, for signs of nervousness beyond what anyone would feel being questioned by police. Brennan's story hadn't changed. He'd been a regular customer, had known Jennifer casually, had been horrified by her disappearance. He'd been home alone the night she vanished, had learned about it the next day when he went to the restaurant and heard people talking. He'd wanted to help, had joined the search parties, had cooperated fully with the investigation. He spoke about Jennifer with what seemed like genuine sadness, said it was terrible what happened, said he hoped the case would be solved someday. Gonzalez asked if he'd thought of anything new over the years, any detail he might have forgotten or dismissed at the time. Brennan shook his head. He wished he could help more, but he simply didn't know anything. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Gonzalez thanked Brennan for his time and watched him walk to his car. She couldn't point to anything specific, couldn't articulate why, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way Brennan had been almost too helpful, too eager to cooperate. Maybe it was the way his hands had trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, the way his eyes had darted to the door when a police cruiser drove past outside. Or maybe it was just the instinct that comes from years of listening to people lie. Gonzalez didn't have evidence, didn't have probable cause, didn't have anything she could act on. But she made a note in the file, follow up on David Brennan. Something off. Over the next year, Gonzalez returned to Jennifer's case periodically, reading through the file again, looking for angles Chen might have missed, hoping for some new piece of information that would break things open. She contacted the FBI to see if there were any similar cases in other jurisdictions, any patterns that might suggest a serial offender. Nothing matched. She submitted evidence for retesting as new forensic technologies became available, hoping that something collected in 2003 might yield results in 2009. The tests came back with nothing useful, no DNA profiles that didn't belong to Jennifer or the people who'd lived in the apartment. Meanwhile, David Brennan continued living his life. He was good at his job, well-liked by colleagues, respected in his neighborhood. He coached his daughter's soccer team. He volunteered with Kelly at church fundraisers. He was, by all appearances, exactly the kind of person you'd want living next door. But inside, in the places he showed no one, the weight was growing heavier. The secret he carried had shaped every decision he'd made for years, had influenced who he married and where he worked and how he spent his time. He'd built a life on top of a lie, and the foundation was cracking. Kelly noticed the changes more clearly as their daughter got older. David was distant sometimes, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. He'd snap at her over small things, then apologize profusely. He'd disappear for walks that lasted hours, coming home with no explanation of where he'd been. She started to wonder if he was having an affair, if there was someone else. That possibility seemed more plausible than the truth, which was that her husband was haunted by something he'd done years ago, something that had destroyed a family and had been eating him alive ever since. In the spring of 2011, 8 years after Jennifer Marshall vanished, Kelly Brennan found something that changed everything. She was looking for their tax returns in David's home office, going through the filing cabinet he usually kept locked but had left open that morning in his rush to get to work. Buried in a folder marked Receipts 2003 was a photograph. It was small, the kind of photo that used to come with wallets or key chains before everything went digital. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. Kelly didn't recognize her at first, but something about the photo felt wrong, felt hidden intentionally. She turned it over. On the back, in faded blue ink, was written simply, Jennifer. Kelly stood in the office for a long time, holding that photograph, her mind racing. Who was Jennifer? Why did David have her photo hidden in his files? She thought about that missing persons case he'd mentioned years ago, the waitress from the restaurant. Had her name been Jennifer? Kelly couldn't remember. She felt her heart pounding, felt the ground shifting beneath her. She told herself there was probably a simple explanation, that she was overreacting, that she should just ask David about it. But some part of her, some instinct she couldn't name, knew that this was not something simple, not something innocent. That evening, after their daughter was in bed, Kelly showed David the photograph. She watched his face as he saw it, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands start to shake. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kelly told him. She asked who Jennifer was. David sat down heavily on the couch, put his head in his hands, and said nothing for a long time. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were filled with tears. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And after I tell you, you're going to leave me. But you deserve to know the truth." What David Brennan told his wife that night would, within days, bring an end to a case that had been cold for nearly a decade. But the ending wouldn't feel like justice to everyone involved. Some truths arrive too late to heal what they've broken. David told Kelly that he had known Jennifer Marshall, not just as a customer but in a way he'd never admitted to anyone. He said he'd been obsessed with her, had convinced himself that she was interested in him when she was just being friendly, just doing her job. He said he'd gone to her apartment that September evening in 2003, had told her his car had broken down nearby and asked if he could use her phone. Jennifer had let him in, had been kind, had turned her back to get him the phone from the kitchen counter. And in that moment, something inside David had snapped. He couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it, couldn't make sense of his own actions even after all these years. He'd grabbed her, had panicked when she started to scream, had held his hand over her mouth until she stopped struggling. He said it happened so fast, said he'd never meant for it to go that far, said he'd realized what he'd done and had been paralyzed with fear and horror. Kelly was shaking as she listened, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't possible. This wasn't the man she'd married. But David kept talking, kept confessing, the words pouring out of him after years of being held inside. He told her he'd wrapped Jennifer's body in a blanket, had put her in his car late that night after the apartment complex had gone quiet. He'd driven east, out toward the rural areas between Lakeland and Fort Meade, to land he knew was rarely visited, property owned by the company he worked for that was slated for development but had been sitting empty for years. He'd buried her there in the darkness, had marked the spot in his mind but nowhere else, had driven home as the sun was coming up and had scrubbed his car and his clothes and his hands until they were raw. David told Kelly he'd tried to convince himself it hadn't happened, that it was a nightmare he'd wake up from. But the investigation started, and he had to face what he'd done. He'd lied to the police, had passed the polygraph because he'd somehow been able to compartmentalize, to separate the person being questioned from the person who'd committed the crime. He'd joined the search parties because it would have seemed suspicious not to, because he'd needed to know what the police knew, whether they were getting close. And then, as months passed and the case went cold, he'd let himself believe he'd gotten away with it. He'd met Kelly. He'd built a life. He'd tried to be a good person, as if that could somehow balance the scales, as if being a devoted husband and father could erase what he'd done to Jennifer Marshall. Kelly didn't say anything for a long time after David stopped talking. She looked at the man she'd shared a life with, the man she'd trusted with her heart and her child, and saw a stranger. Finally, her voice quiet and steady, she said, "You need to turn yourself in. You need to tell the police what you did." David nodded. He knew she was right. He'd known for years that this moment would come eventually, that secrets this heavy don't stay buried forever. That night, Kelly took their daughter and left. She went to her sister's house, called a lawyer, tried to figure out what came next. The next morning, David Brennan walked into the Lakeland Police Department and asked to speak with someone about the Jennifer Marshall case. Detective Gonzalez was called in. She sat across from Brennan in an interview room, and when he said he needed to confess to Jennifer's murder, she felt her heart start to pound. After all these years, after all the dead ends and frustration, the answer had walked through the door on its own. Brennan's confession was recorded, detailed, and ultimately verified. He led investigators to the location where he'd buried Jennifer, a scrubby piece of land off a dirt road that had been partly cleared for development but never built on. The remains were recovered in April 2011. They were identified through dental records as Jennifer Marshall. She'd been missing for 7 years and 7 months. For her family, the confirmation was both devastating and necessary. They'd always known, in their hearts, that she was gone. But knowing and having proof are different things. The remains gave them something to bury, a place to visit, a way to say goodbye that hadn't been possible before. David Brennan was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The distinction mattered legally. Prosecutors determined they couldn't prove premeditation, couldn't show that Brennan had gone to Jennifer's apartment with the intent to kill. The evidence suggested a crime of opportunity, of impulse, of a moment that spiraled into tragedy. Brennan's defense attorney argued for manslaughter, claimed there had been no intent, that Brennan had been genuinely remorseful and had ultimately confessed voluntarily. The prosecution argued that Brennan had hidden the crime for nearly a decade, had lied to investigators repeatedly, had shown consciousness of guilt by concealing Jennifer's body and living a normal life while her family suffered. In the fall of 2011, David Brennan pled guilty to second-degree murder as part of an agreement with prosecutors. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Sandra Marshall was allowed to speak. She stood before the court, looked at the man who had taken her daughter, and said, "You stole her life. You stole our future. You stole every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday we should have had together. You lived with your secret while we lived with unbearable pain, never knowing, never able to grieve properly. I hope you think about Jennifer every day for the rest of your life. I hope you remember her smile, her kindness, the person she was. And I hope you understand that you can never, ever make this right." Brennan, his head down, whispered, "I'm sorry." Sandra turned away from him. Sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The resolution of Jennifer Marshall's case sent ripples through Lakeland in ways both expected and surprising. For Sandra Marshall and her family, there was relief in having answers, in knowing that Jennifer hadn't suffered long, in understanding that her death hadn't been planned or prolonged. But the relief was tangled up with rage, with the realization that David Brennan had been living freely all those years while they'd been drowning in grief. Michael Marshall struggled with violent fantasies about what he'd like to do to Brennan. Jennifer's grandmother, who had never stopped setting a place for Jennifer at holiday dinners, died 6 months after the case was solved. The family believed she'd been waiting to know what happened, that she'd held on until she had answers. For Kelly Brennan, the aftermath was its own kind of nightmare. Her marriage ended immediately. She filed for divorce, filed for full custody of their daughter, moved to another city to escape the media attention and the stares from people who wondered how she could have not known, how she could have slept beside a murderer for years and never suspected. She struggled with guilt and shame that weren't hers to carry but felt impossible to shake. She'd loved a man who had killed someone. What did that say about her? What did that say about her judgment? She went through years of therapy, trying to separate herself from David's crime, trying to help her daughter understand why Daddy was gone and would never come home. For Detective Gonzalez, solving the case after so many years was bittersweet. She was glad to give the Marshall family answers, glad to see justice done even if it came late. But she also understood that nothing about this outcome felt like a victory. A young woman was still dead. A family was still destroyed. And the case had only been solved because Brennan's guilt had finally overwhelmed him, not because of brilliant detective work or technological breakthroughs. Gonzalez thought about all the cases that would never be solved because the guilty parties never confessed, never broke down, never made mistakes. She thought about the randomness of it all, the fact that if Kelly Brennan hadn't found that photograph, if David Brennan had been just a little more careful about locking his filing cabinet, Jennifer's case might still be open today. The confession raised questions that would linger in Lakeland for years afterward. People who had known David Brennan, who had worked alongside him or lived near him or trusted him with their children, struggled to reconcile the friendly neighbor with the man who had killed Jennifer Marshall. How do you process that kind of cognitive dissonance? How do you accept that someone can be kind to your face while carrying such darkness inside? Co-workers remembered times when Brennan had been helpful, generous, normal. Parents remembered him coaching soccer with patience and enthusiasm. These memories didn't disappear just because the truth came out. They existed alongside the horror, making everything more complicated, more unsettling. Some people in the community felt sympathy for Kelly and her daughter, understanding that they were victims of Brennan's crime in their own way. Others were less charitable, spreading rumors that Kelly must have known something, must have seen signs, must have been willfully blind. The scrutiny was relentless and cruel. Kelly eventually changed her daughter's last name, moved to South Carolina where no one knew their story, and tried to build something resembling a normal life. She would later tell a therapist that she still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, wondering what Jennifer Marshall had thought in those final moments, wondering if she'd been afraid, wondering if she'd understood what was happening. For the restaurant where Jennifer had worked, the resolution brought a strange kind of closure. Several employees who had been there in 2003 still worked there in 2011. They'd never forgotten Jennifer, had always wondered what happened to her, had carried small guilts about whether they could have done something differently. Learning that a regular customer, someone they'd served meals to and made small talk with, had been her killer was chilling. The manager who had been annoyed when Jennifer didn't show up for work that September evening carried a particular kind of pain. He thought about the moment he'd decided not to drive to her apartment to check on her, thought about how those hours might have mattered, even though logically he knew Jennifer was likely already dead by the time her shift was supposed to start. The case renewed conversations in Lakeland about safety, about trusting strangers, about the ways danger can wear a familiar face. Parents held their children a little tighter. Women were more cautious about letting people into their homes, even people they recognized. The illusion of safety that small city life provided had been cracked, and while life moved forward, the wariness remained. David Brennan had lived among them for years after killing Jennifer, had smiled at neighbors, had eaten at restaurants, had walked through grocery stores like any normal person. That reality was harder to shake than the crime itself. In prison, David Brennan became something of a ghost. Other inmates knew what he'd done, knew he'd killed a young woman and hidden it for years. In prison hierarchies, that marked him. He kept to himself, didn't make friends, spent most of his time in the library reading or writing letters that no one responded to. He wrote to Sandra Marshall once, a long letter attempting to explain himself, to offer some deeper apology than the one he'd given in court. Sandra threw it away without reading it. She didn't need his explanations. She didn't need his remorse. She needed her daughter back, and that was something he could never give her. The years after 2011 were a slow process of learning to live with answers that didn't bring peace. Sandra Marshall continued running her support group for families of missing persons, and she found that her experience gave her unique credibility. She could talk about the before and the after, about what it meant to finally know and how that knowledge both helped and hurt. She became an advocate for better resources for cold case investigations, for keeping databases updated, for never giving up on cases no matter how old they got. She testified before the state legislature, pushing for funding and policies that would help other families avoid the years of limbo she'd endured. Michael Marshall struggled more than his mother did. The anger didn't fade for him the way it did for Sandra. He couldn't forgive David Brennan. He couldn't accept the 30-year sentence, which meant Brennan could potentially be released someday, could walk free again while Jennifer would never have that chance. Michael wrote letters to the parole board preemptively, making sure they understood his opposition to any early release. He monitored Brennan's prison records obsessively, looking for infractions or signs that Brennan wasn't genuinely remorseful. The case had consumed 8 years of not knowing, and then it consumed years more of knowing but not being able to move past it. Jennifer's friends, the ones who had been young and full of possibility in 2003, were approaching middle age by 2011. They had careers and marriages and children of their own. Learning what happened to Jennifer forced them to confront their own mortality in ways they'd been able to avoid when she was just missing. Death had been abstract before, something that happened to other people. Now it was real, concrete, tied to someone they'd laughed with and confided in. They gathered for a memorial service after her remains were laid to rest, and it felt strange to grieve so long after the fact, to cry for someone who had been gone for nearly a decade but who they were only now able to properly mourn. The property where Jennifer's remains were found became a marker of sorts, though not an official one. The development project that had stalled for years eventually moved forward, and houses were built on the land. The new residents didn't know what had been found there, didn't know they were living near the spot where a young woman had been buried in darkness by the man who killed her. But people in Lakeland knew. They drove past that subdivision sometimes and thought about Jennifer, about how close she'd been all those years while everyone was searching, about how many times cars might have passed within yards of her without knowing. Detective Gonzalez retired from the Lakeland Police Department in 2018. She'd solved other cases in the years after Jennifer's, had built a reputation as someone who didn't give up on cold cases, who understood that families deserved answers even decades later. But Jennifer's case stayed with her in a particular way. Maybe because it had been her first major cold case solve. Maybe because the resolution had been so unexpected, so dependent on factors outside police control. Or maybe because she'd seen what confession could do, how it could break one family and destroy another, how truth could be both healing and devastating. In the years after Brennan's confession, forensic psychologists and criminal profilers studied the case, trying to understand what had led an apparently normal man to kill. Some theorized about impulse control disorders, about obsessive tendencies that Brennan had hidden well, about the ways violent thoughts can escalate in people who seem outwardly functional. Others focused on the aftermath, on how Brennan had compartmentalized his guilt, how he'd managed to maintain a double life for so long. There were no definitive answers, just theories and speculation. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. Some people are capable of terrible things, and they can hide those capabilities behind ordinary facades. The case raised uncomfortable questions about polygraph tests, about how Brennan had passed when he was clearly guilty. Experts explained that polygraphs measure physical responses to stress, and some people can control those responses or genuinely believe their own lies in the moment. Brennan had apparently been able to separate his public self from the private knowledge of what he'd done, creating enough psychological distance to remain calm during questioning. This revelation made some investigators more skeptical of polygraph results, more aware that they were tools but not guarantees, indicators but not proof. By 2015, 4 years after the case was solved, Jennifer Marshall's story had become part of Lakeland's history, taught as a cautionary tale about the persistence required in cold case investigations, about the importance of never fully closing a file, about listening to instinct even when evidence is lacking. Gonzalez's decision to re-interview Brennan hadn't directly led to the confession, but it had kept the case active in ways that mattered. She'd noted her concerns, had kept Brennan on the radar, had ensured that if any new information emerged, investigators would know where to look. Sandra Marshall found some measure of peace, though it came slowly and incompletely. She visited Jennifer's grave regularly, bringing flowers and sitting in the quiet of the cemetery, talking to her daughter the way she'd done in the years when Jennifer's body hadn't been found but her spirit felt close. Sandra remarried in 2016, a widower she'd met through her support group who understood grief in ways most people couldn't. They built a life together that honored the past without being consumed by it. Sandra learned that you could carry loss and still find moments of joy, that healing wasn't about forgetting but about learning to hold sorrow and hope in the same space. The question of why David Brennan eventually confessed remained a subject of debate. Some believed it was genuine remorse, that the guilt had eaten away at him until he couldn't bear it anymore. Others thought Kelly finding the photograph had simply left him no choice, that he'd confessed because he knew his wife would turn him in anyway and he wanted to control the narrative. Still others believed it was a combination, that the photograph had triggered a crisis but that Brennan had been moving toward confession for years, that the weight of the secret had been crushing him slowly, that Kelly's discovery was the final push he needed. Kelly Brennan rarely spoke about her ex-husband or what had happened. She protected her daughter fiercely, tried to shield her from the worst details, tried to help her understand that she was not responsible for her father's choices, that she carried no blame for his crime. The girl grew up knowing her father was in prison, knowing he'd done something terrible, but Kelly carefully controlled how much information she received and when. It was a delicate balance, protecting innocence while preparing her for a reality she'd eventually have to face fully. In Lakeland, the restaurant where Jennifer had worked eventually closed, a victim of changing dining habits and economic shifts that had nothing to do with tragedy. The apartment complex where she'd lived was renovated and renamed. The physical spaces that had been part of her story were gradually erased or transformed, the way all places are over time. But the memory remained, carried by people who had known her, by investigators who had worked her case, by a community that had learned how quickly ordinary life can turn into nightmare. The case appeared in true crime databases, in articles about cold cases that got solved, in training materials for detectives learning how to approach old investigations. Jennifer's name lived on in those contexts, her story told and retold, analyzed and discussed. Sandra found comfort in that sometimes, in knowing that Jennifer wasn't forgotten, that her life and death meant something beyond the immediate circle of people who had loved her. But sometimes it hurt, seeing her daughter reduced to a case study, to a set of facts and timelines that didn't capture who Jennifer had really been. David Brennan became eligible for parole consideration in 2026, though Sandra Marshall and Michael were prepared to fight any release. They'd organized a network of people committed to attending every parole hearing, to making sure the board understood the ongoing impact of Brennan's crime, to ensuring he served his full sentence if possible. The thought of him walking free while Jennifer remained in the ground was unbearable. They understood that justice had been served in a legal sense, that Brennan had been convicted and punished. But some wounds don't close, some losses can't be balanced by any sentence. For the investigators who had worked Jennifer's case over the years, there were lessons that stayed with them. Detective Chen, long retired, followed the resolution from a distance, glad the case had been solved but sorry it had taken so long. He thought about the interview he'd conducted with Brennan in 2003, wondered if there had been something he'd missed, some sign he should have caught. He knew, intellectually, that he'd done everything right, that Brennan had been skilled at deception, that without evidence there was nothing more he could have done. But the what-ifs lingered anyway, the way they always do in cases that go cold. The Lakeland Police Department used Jennifer's case as a teaching example, a reminder that witnesses and suspects should be periodically re-interviewed even in cold cases, that people's circumstances change and guilt accumulates over time, that sometimes the break comes from persistence rather than brilliance. They emphasized the importance of keeping cases active even when leads dry up, of maintaining relationships with victims' families, of never treating a cold case as truly closed. These lessons were valuable, learned from tragedy, paid for with years of grief. As the 20th anniversary of Jennifer's death approached in 2023, Sandra Marshall organized a community remembrance. It was smaller than the vigils and searches of 2003, but the people who came were deeply committed, genuinely there to honor Jennifer's memory rather than satisfy curiosity. They lit candles, shared stories, spoke about who Jennifer had been beyond the crime that ended her life. She'd had dreams and plans, had been funny and kind, had loved her family and friends, had been more than a victim. The remembrance was an attempt to reclaim her story from the violence that had defined it, to remind everyone that Jennifer Marshall was a person first, a tragedy second. Michael Marshall spoke at the remembrance, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. He talked about his sister's laugh, about the way she'd always remembered everyone's birthday, about how she'd wanted to manage a hotel someday and see the world. He said that David Brennan had stolen those dreams, had taken a future that should have been bright and full of possibility. But he also said that Jennifer's life had meant something, that she'd touched people in ways that endured, that memory could be its own form of justice when legal justice felt insufficient. In prison, David Brennan was not invited to participate in that remembrance, was not asked for his thoughts or reflections. He existed at the margins of Jennifer's story now, the villain who had been caught, the answer to a question that had haunted a community for years. He would serve his time, would potentially be released someday as an old man with no life to return to, no family waiting, no place that felt like home. The life he'd built on a foundation of lies had crumbled, and there was nothing left to rebuild. That was its own kind of prison, separate from the physical one he inhabited. The resolution of Jennifer Marshall's case didn't change the fundamental truth that some losses can't be recovered, some pain can't be erased. But it did provide something that families of missing persons desperately need, an end to the uncertainty, an answer to the question of what happened. Not knowing is its own special torture, worse in some ways than even the worst truth. Sandra Marshall had lived in that limbo for years, and while learning her daughter was dead was devastating, it was also somehow freeing. She could grieve properly now. She could say goodbye. She could know. The case also served as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, doesn't always wear a recognizable face. David Brennan had been someone's co-worker, someone's neighbor, someone's husband and father. He'd functioned in normal society, had been trusted and liked, had given no obvious warning signs that he was capable of murder. That reality was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire story, the idea that danger could be so close, so ordinary, so hidden in plain sight. It challenged comfortable assumptions about being able to identify threats, about trusting instinct, about the reliability of surface appearances. For Lakeland, the case became part of the city's collective memory, one of those events that define an era for people who lived through it. If you were in Lakeland in 2003, you remembered when Jennifer Marshall disappeared. You remembered the searches, the posters, the way it felt to look at everyone with suspicion, wondering who might know something, who might be hiding truth. And if you were still in Lakeland in 2011, you remembered the shock of learning that David Brennan, a man many people had known casually, had been responsible all along. Those memories didn't fade, even as years passed and new tragedies claimed attention. The story of Jennifer Marshall was a story about time, about how much of it was stolen from her, about how long her family suffered without answers, about how many years David Brennan lived freely while carrying his secret. It was about the slow grind of cold case investigations, about patience and persistence, about the way justice sometimes arrives late but still matters. It was about community, about the ways tragedy binds people together and tears them apart, about collective trauma and collective healing. And it was about the fragility of ordinary life, about how quickly everything can change, about how a normal September evening can become the last moment of normal you ever experience. 20 years is a long time to wait for truth. Jennifer Marshall's family waited nearly 8 before they got theirs, and while that time was excruciating, they eventually got what so many families of missing persons never receive: answers. The cost was high, measured in sleepless nights and endless tears, in birthdays celebrated without her and holidays shadowed by her absence. But the alternative, never knowing, living forever in uncertainty, was worse. The case also highlighted the role of chance in solving crimes. If Kelly Brennan hadn't needed those tax returns, if David hadn't forgotten to lock his filing cabinet, if she hadn't found that photograph, Jennifer's case might still be unsolved. That randomness was both frustrating and humbling for investigators who dedicated their careers to solving crimes through skill and determination. Sometimes, despite all efforts, despite all expertise, the break comes from luck, from small mistakes, from moments that could have easily gone differently. As 2024 approached, more than 20 years after Jennifer Marshall's murder, Sandra Marshall was in her mid-60s, a grandmother herself now. She'd survived what no parent should have to survive, had built a life in the aftermath of unbearable loss, had found purpose in helping other families navigate similar tragedies. She thought about Jennifer every day, not with the raw, consuming grief of the early years but with a quieter sadness, a permanent ache that had become part of who she was. She'd learned that you don't get over losing a child. You just learn to carry it differently. Michael Marshall had also found ways to channel his pain into something constructive. He worked with victim advocacy groups, spoke at conferences about the impact of violent crime on families, pushed for policy changes that would better support survivors. He'd turned his obsessive need to understand what happened to his sister into a broader mission to help others. The work didn't take away his grief, but it gave it meaning, transformed his rage into something that might prevent other families from suffering the way his had. Jennifer's case had become a touchstone for discussions about cold cases in Florida and beyond. It was cited in articles about the importance of DNA databases, about the need for adequate funding for cold case units, about the psychological toll on families who live without answers. Jennifer's name appeared in legislative testimony, in grant applications for victim services, in training materials for crisis counselors. Her death had become part of larger conversations about justice, about memory, about what society owes to victims and their families. The apartment where Jennifer had lived was now home to a young couple with no knowledge of its history. They'd moved in years after the case was solved, had no reason to research the building's past. They lived their ordinary lives in that space, completely unaware that a woman had disappeared from those rooms 20 years earlier, that a family had been destroyed because of what happened within those walls. The disconnect between past and present, between tragedy and everyday life, was striking. Places don't remember. Only people do. David Brennan's daughter was now a teenager, growing up with the knowledge that her father was a murderer. Kelly had tried to protect her for as long as possible, but eventually the truth had to be told. The girl struggled with her identity, with what it meant to be the child of someone who had done something so terrible. She was in therapy, working through anger and shame and confusion. She hadn't visited her father in prison since she was 8 years old, had no plans to see him again. In some ways, she'd lost a parent too, just as Jennifer's family had lost Jennifer. The crime's impact rippled outward in ways that were hard to fully measure. Looking back at the timeline, at the years between Jennifer's disappearance and the resolution of her case, certain moments stood out as inflection points. The decision to re-interview Brennan in 2008, even though it led nowhere immediately. Kelly's choice to look through her husband's files that day in 2011. Brennan's decision to keep that photograph instead of destroying it, to hold on to some physical reminder of Jennifer even though it risked exposing him. These small moments, seemingly insignificant at the time, had been crucial to how the story ultimately unfolded. The case also raised questions about the death penalty, about appropriate sentences for murder, about what justice really means. 30 years felt like too little to some people, like a fraction of what Jennifer had lost, what her family continued to lose every day. To others, it seemed proportionate given that Brennan had no prior record, given that the crime hadn't been premeditated, given that he'd eventually confessed. There were no easy answers, no sentence that would feel adequate, no punishment that would balance the scales. Justice is imperfect, always incomplete, always leaving someone unsatisfied. For the broader true crime community, Jennifer's case was both fascinating and frustrating. Fascinating because of the psychological aspects, because of how Brennan had hidden in plain sight for years, because of the way the resolution came through confession rather than evidence. Frustrating because it didn't fit neat narratives about how cases get solved, didn't provide satisfying forensic breakthroughs or brilliant detective work that led to the killer. It was messier than that, more dependent on human weakness and chance than on skill or science. That made it a less compelling story in some ways, but a more honest one. In the end, Jennifer Marshall's case was about the long shadow that violence casts, about the way a single act can reverberate through decades, affecting dozens or hundreds of lives in ways both obvious and subtle. It was about a young woman whose life was cut short before she had a chance to become who she might have been. It was about a family that never stopped fighting for answers, never stopped believing that truth mattered even when finding it seemed impossible. It was about a community that rallied together in crisis, that held vigils and searched and hoped, that was shaken by betrayal when the truth finally emerged. And it was about time, the time stolen from Jennifer, the time her family spent in agony, the time David Brennan spent living a lie, the time it took for justice to arrive. 20 years between crime and arrest is a lifetime. Children are born and grow into adults. People marry and divorce, build careers, move across the country. The world changes in countless ways. But for the people at the center of a tragedy, time moves differently. The wound stays fresh even as years pass. The pain doesn't diminish just because calendars flip forward. Sandra Marshall would tell you that getting answers changed everything and changed nothing. She was glad to know what happened to Jennifer, glad that Brennan was in prison, glad that her daughter's remains had been recovered and properly laid to rest. But Jennifer was still gone. The years of not knowing had still been agonizing. The life they should have had together was still lost forever. Truth brought a kind of closure, but closure doesn't mean the pain ends. It just means you stop waiting for it to end and start learning to live with it. The people who stay for stories like this, who listen to the end, who want to understand what happens when someone vanishes and a family is left with questions, those people understand that these aren't just crimes. They're human stories, messy and complicated, full of pain and persistence, marked by failures and small victories. Jennifer Marshall was real. Sandra Marshall is real. The grief they've carried, the years they've lost, the justice that came too late, all of it is real. These stories matter not because they're shocking or sensational, but because they remind us what's at stake when violence enters ordinary lives, when someone decides that another person's life matters less than their own desires or fears. If you stayed with Jennifer's story until this moment, you're someone who understands why these cases deserve to be remembered, why victims deserve to be more than statistics, why families deserve answers no matter how long it takes. That kind of attention, that kind of caring, is what keeps these stories alive, what pushes investigators to keep trying, what makes it possible for families to keep hoping. What part of Jennifer Marshall's story stayed with you the most? Was it the years of silence, the weight of a secret carried for so long, or the moment when truth finally broke through? Please take a moment to subscribe to Cold Crime Cases, because every story we tell honors a life that was taken and a family that refused to give up. These stories exist because people like you believe they matter, because you understand that memory is its own form of justice when the legal kind comes too late. Jennifer Marshall was 23 years old when she died. She wanted to manage hotels, to see the world, to keep making people smile the way she always had. She deserved the chance to live that life, to grow old, to discover who she would become. David Brennan took that from her in a moment of violence that he spent years trying to hide. But he couldn't erase her, couldn't make her disappear completely, because the people who loved Jennifer never stopped looking for truth. And in the end, 20 years later, truth found its way into the light. Rest in peace, Jennifer Marshall. Your life mattered. Your story matters. You are not forgotten. I'll see you in the next case.